Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is David Sambek. I'm the lead industry and service officer from APO. So today I invite you Dr. Vasilina Racheva. She is working for World Economic Forum based in Switzerland. She's head of Insight Products Coordination, Center for the New Economy and Society. So it is my great pleasure to have her for our interview today. So today's interview actually is about the data-driven decision making, or how we are going to use data to manage the organizations and also the resources. So for that, I'm going to ask her the importance of data, because we talk about the data-driven decision making nowadays all the time. But it's true so that many people just talk about it for its own sake without understanding how to make good use of the data. So maybe you can share your insight on that first.
Certainly. So the very important thing about data, and in particular metrics that package that data and make it into usable information, is that it helps us quantify a problem and diagnose where the solutions might lie, and then parse out those solutions by population, by area of action. So essentially, data just allows us to empower decisions with so much more information, but also packaged in a way that is meaningful for what we're trying to target.
People talk about the data is the actually gold, but at the same time, I'm going to ask you the very fundamental and basic question first. I would like to ask you, the data is important, we all know that, but at the same time, how we are going to collect the data in a right way? Because there's so much data out there. Some data is relevant, some data is not relevant, of course, depending on what we want to achieve.
So one of the things we've seen over and over again is that the reason people make the analogy that data is like gold or oil is because in its raw form, it's often not usable. More often than not, people have a lot of data, but they don't refine and develop that data to make it usable. And this is really the pivotal point for what is important as a kind of strategic priority for any organizations that want to make their data into something that they can actually leverage to create more value. Essentially, identifying what data you currently have, identifying what are the gaps in that data. So maybe there are aspects that are not being collected right now that need to be collected. And then understanding what it will take to refine that data into something that it's a usable metric. And in itself, that second aspect has a lot of challenges, but it's also one of the more exciting areas of opportunity in the new economy.
We always remember that there's some movie from the Hollywood is there are two detectives. One detective is make a decision based upon the data, precise information, and trying to collect the data as much as they can. But at the same time, on the other hand, another detective is actually make a decision based upon their gut feelings. I understand the importance of gut feelings also because sometimes it is right. But when it comes to the managing the big organization, whether it's big or small, I think just relying on the gut feelings actually can be very risky. When it comes to the people, it's not that easy to just ask people to, okay, now we are living in the digital era, so just make good use of the data. And then people can be confused about, okay, what should I do?
Yeah, certainly. One of the things is that essentially we as humans are computation machines in one way or another. We gather so many points of data in our daily lives and almost imperceivably to us process them. So what people often call gut feel can be leaning upon implicit data that we are aware of. We pick up on a lot of signals from the outside world and almost imperceivably distill that into an understanding of where the solutions might lie. But this kind of decision making can be enhanced and supplemented by metrics that are meaningful to what we're trying to understand and what we want to solve for. That doesn't mean that this exists in the wild without additional work. For example, if you look at the kind of human capital metrics that we might need in order to shape an organization that is diverse, that can actually have the right talent and progresses the right people through its ranks, we might have a sense, an implicit sense of where our organizations are right now. But until there is the human capital metrics within an organization that can tell you what people's skills are, how they're progressing through the organization, maybe how they were evaluated before they progressed through the organization, that sense of where the organization is vis-a-vis human capital is not going to be fully quantified. And sometimes surprising challenges and gaps appear when we crunch the numbers and see what actually appears on paper. So I think of it more as a triangulation between the human intelligence we all hold and the insight we have from there, and the actual intelligence we can get from focusing a set of metrics that can help us really understand the issues. If you think of your two detectives, there were two of them, and between them, they added up to a much better whole. So I think you can always think of this as being two sides of any decision maker, the gut feel side and the quantified side.
Actually, when we had this pandemic, COVID-19, many companies and organizations had no choice but to just go through the digital transformation. But when it comes to digital transformation, I think we had a similar issue. Technology is available and the system is available somewhere out there. We just have to reach out to the vendors, for example. We just work with them, and they will help us to design the system based upon the digital transformation and the data. It's very difficult for people to actually adjust themselves to it. And it's really harder than we can imagine, because people have difficulty changing their habits. I'm sure that there's no panacea to help people to change their habits overnight. But do you have any good solution to, maybe not the best, but at least maybe this is better than nothing kind of way to help people to change their behavior?
Yes, certainly. One thing that we often hear is that digital transformation is a process. It's a change management process. It's not something that happens overnight. It requires a plan. And it also requires people to actually invest the time to identify how different systems fit together and how you can see data coming across different systems in-house. It does require different kinds of talent sometimes, or reskilling your existing workforce. This is where at the World Economic Forum, what we've ended up doing is really mapping out what are the new jobs rising in demand. And we can see a very solid chunk of jobs that are really about data, that they're really about knowing how to work with digital products. Now, who can do those roles? We don't have enough talent if only those who we train right now do them. We actually need to reskill people. We need to take them on the journey with us so that they get the right data skills to feel confident and knowledgeable about these systems, because that transformation process indeed does require a lot of people in your organization, and it's worth it from what we've seen from those organizations who are more digital and more productive and more successful, but it doesn't happen overnight.
We are reading the newspapers about how people are laid off because of the AI and because of the data. There is a very famous company I cannot name, but they laid off their traders, for example, almost all of them, and then they adopt the AI. So in that sense, actually, many organizations might be mistaken to believe that once we adopt this kind of a digital system, or let's say the digital transformation, and they make a decision based upon data, of course, which is not the problem. But when it comes to the adopting the kind of AI, and then also we turn everything into like a data center, then maybe people are afraid to lose their jobs also. Do you think it's just a process, or something's not right about how the organizations that deal with this kind of transformation maybe?
Yeah, it's interesting because what we know is the demand for those digital roles is increasing, as is demand actually for very human roles, roles such as that involve a lot of leadership in managing people. Now, it depends really on how an organization sets out to transition into a new iteration of its current self. You could say there could be a very impulsive drive to think, okay, all the talent that could possibly animate this new trajectory will be external. And some of it may well be. But when you actually work through how much of that talent can come from the outside, what would it take to buy in talent versus develop talent? What would you be losing from the people who already know your organization well, but don't know the digital component of where it could head? So essentially, when we're thinking about how you can transition into that new iteration of your business model that is more powered by data, that is more powered by the digital ecosystem, there are options to take. And one of those options is to really think through redeploying your workforce. When we did this for the Future of Jobs survey, we asked the business leaders how many of those transitions that you're expecting to see from those workers who are going to be displaced. We could see that there's actually quite reasonable ambition on the global level, that when there is this kind of need to change your workforce towards that more digitally powered and data powered way, then people are looking to see, can we use our current workforce who already understand our business model, who already understand who we are at our DNA, might share those values and are willing to take that journey with us. And the question becomes much more, what do we do in order to carry them on that journey? What are the courses we can provide? What is the infrastructure we can put in place for that redeployment? And how can we manage that process throughout an organization?
I understand that reskilling and upskilling can be important, and these people already know the organization, so why do we have to let them go? Maybe it's better we just help them to be trained. That will be really a great and ideal scenario. In reality, if I were, let's say, that the CEO of the company, then if I think that time is not enough, then we really have to do this as soon as possible, or we really have to go with the speed, then I might just think that, just let them go, because some of them can never understand what the data-driven decision-making is, or they don't even understand that how to make good use of the data. Then why don't we just go out and just find some people who already have the understanding, instead of just training people that we already have to never understand, like dinosaurs?
There are different trade-offs in that decision. There's the risk that your current employees won't make the journey, and it will be a wasted effort. There is a worry that also people don't actually want to go on that reskilling journey, and maybe some of them don't. But there's an additional blind side that very few people think about when they think about reskilling their current employees or hiring externally. When you go out there to the market, and a lot of organizations do that, and you try and find those future employees, the talent is not there in the aggregate for the amount of demand there is. And many of the people who'll be coming in would have just recently reskilled themselves into these roles, or you'll be hiring a lot of very young people. So essentially, it is not as easy an equation as let's just kind of pick and mix between our current employees and an infinite pool of talent that exists out there. We have the amount of talent we have out there in the world, and there's currently a global shortage of enough digital talent in order to meet the demand that will come if we embrace this kind of digital innovation to the degree we should. And that makes for a very good case for actually investing a bit more time to work out who are the people who are willing to make that journey and transition within their organizations. But also, of course, there are many of those roles that are ancillary to a digital transformation of an organization, to a more data-driven to a movement to a more data-driven organization, that are not involved in coding, but in the support structure around this. So really, what over and over again, looking at the data.
You also have to think about the quality of the data, because if we have a poor data quality, it can lead to the wrong decision. So in the Accenture study, only 33% of firms reported that they trusted their data enough to use it effectively. and derive values from it. So is there any effective way to improve data quality or ensure the data quality?
If we think through what makes for good data, one of the most straightforward ways to actually examine quality of data is to think with research methodologies. So we actually have quite strong understandings of what research methodologies are. What is a representative sample? How many people is enough? Is the data clean enough? Is it not clean enough? Those are things that analysts and researchers have done for more years than the past few years of digital transformation. It's definitely something that there are a lot of resources about. Now, the bigger question is, how do you improve data quality? And how do you understand where there's the potential to refine that data into a high quality asset that can help you make better decisions?
Data collection is one thing, but analytics is also important, because translators can help build a shared understanding of business context with data skill sets, and organizations can identify where data will add the most value. So this is the challenge that our teams must overcome if they want to scale value across brands, markets, or their products. So maybe you can explain to us descriptive analytics and predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics.
We're getting technical. So descriptive analytics, once you have your data, what is the summary of what your data is telling you? It is the most basic way of being able to say, all right, like on average, people have this response, or the distribution of individuals who hold this job title is X. Now, you start getting more advanced when you start thinking about predicting things on the basis of your data. You need enough observations. You might need AI models. You might not need AI models. A lot of people don't need AI models. And you need to understand what is the actual history of being able to predict things on the basis of particular kinds of data. This is where you might indeed have quite significant data gaps in order to actually predict what you're trying to predict. You might need a very focused effort to expand your data assets in order to do this. And one of the big questions there, of course, becomes one of ethics. So we can't just use data for any purpose without understanding the ethical implications. In Europe, we have very strong data ethics standards, the GDPR principle, but there's a very big conversation about the reuse of data which was not collected for a particular purpose into that new purpose. And that means that the data lifecycle from one context to the next needs to be mapped. And it asks very particular questions around the design of data collection. How do you make sure the subjects of your data collected are informed of its purposes, that they consent to that purpose? At what stage do you actually keep data? For how long? Are there any concerns about this data falling in the hands of the wrong people who might not use it for benefits related to improving business productivity or to improving the experience of workers, for example, but who use it for purposes that are more nefarious? So there are lots of ethical questions that come into play when we think about collecting big data, but also the big data is, of course, one of the most valuable assets when you're talking about building models that can help you get a better understanding of what the future might hold.
So how can we design an appropriate organizational structure to support the analytics activities? Without adequate level of support, business users will struggle with both interpreting the data and leveraging the analytics tools capabilities. So without a serious commitment to becoming the data-driven as an organization, analytics talent may just leave the organizations.
It's true that it is possible to invest in more analysts, but not think through the infrastructure that will allow them to thrive in an organization. So if you think of hiring 2, 3, 4, 5, a team of data scientists, the next question, next pressure point will be, all right, so do those data scientists or even data analysts have the right tools at their disposal? Is the procurement system for gathering those tools resilient and able to handle their requests? are there new data security and overall IT security issues that might arise from what they wish to do? Are they going to be supported in what they're trying to drive? Is what the information they're going to present going to be understandable to the business audience currently in the organization? One very easy way to create data teams that don't thrive is to make sure that they're working on something that no one quite understands and that has no very specific business use that is immediately relevant and important. So also being able to work on the right task and to actually deliver something that is valuable and important to the organization helps those incubated new teams to succeed.
Let's say, for example, there are some e-commerce platform, online platform businesses, companies. Many companies actually try to sell their products through that platform. But as you know, there also is a trend that direct to consumer, so D2C, is actually rising. And it's actually on the increase. I think it's also because of the data. Because if you sell your products through the platform, then actually you have very limited data about your consumer behaviors or their purchase history, etc. So do you think that this kind of D2C trend will be even more than before, you think?
It doesn't have to be the case that you don't have knowledge about your customers if you have a B2B model and someone else has more access to that data. It just depends on whether you have structure in place to actually get that data back to your organization in a partnership with the organization that holds the data to begin with to actually leverage it better. So I think it really depends on the configuration of how this is structured.
So we analyze all this data to see what is going to happen tomorrow so that we can be better prepared. So that's why we talked about this technical things like descriptive analytics and predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics. So my question is, this forward-looking mindset is very important to success. So how can we move from a descriptive mindset to the predictive mindset? Because people tend to be stuck in the analyzing things, analyzing data. Okay, so this is what we have so far. But when it comes to how we are going to make use of that so that you can predict in a way that what's going to happen tomorrow. But it comes down to how you're going to make analysis of what you have so that you can build a good strategy for tomorrow. But it's not that easy because many people are, as I said, stuck in that data analysis and then, where do we go from here?
I wouldn't put necessarily a hierarchy on any one of these areas so explicitly. Yes, it's incredibly high value to be able to predict what will happen in the future. It's also incredibly difficult to be able to predict what will happen in the future. And when you think of a lot of the problems that can be solved by business analytics or data science in business, or just in general, kind of having better metrics within the running of an organization, you're thinking about a range of problems, some of which actually need very simple tools. And what is very easy to succeed at and potentially quite high value is to solve those easy problems first and set your sights on those challenging problems that will require a lot more investment, a lot more resources. But there are a host of easy problems like, do you have good HR data? Do you have a good sense of who purchases your products? And it just are able to look at those figures in a reasonable way. If you have 2 to 3 different systems that all do different things, are you able to connect the data between those systems and give a holistic view of what's happening between your customer relationships system and then your purchasing and various other bits and pieces of process? So there are actually challenges that can be solved at the lower end of analytical complexity that are not worth discarding on the onset.
To collect the data, we are kind of worried about the security of the data. So I wonder how you see this kind of data collection, because in some countries, as you know, data privacy legislation like the General Data Protection Regulation, agreed upon by the European Parliament and Council in April 2016, to replace the Data Protection Directive 9546 EC in spring 2018 as a primary law regulating how companies protect the EU citizens' personal data. This challenges the lack of transparency and effective governance over how platforms collect and use data. But I think it's not confined to only the platform businesses. So in general, people are worried about their data. So how do you think that we have to handle this kind of privacy issues when it comes to the data collection?
One of the interesting things that has been remarked upon on this, and actually there's a lot of great work from other colleagues in the World Economic Forum who worked on trust in data, is the fact that it is very easy to take data from people and to use that for business purposes. But what is the license that businesses have to do so? What are the rights that people have to know that their data is being used in the way in which they consent to their data being used? This is fundamental to having trust in the new world that we're entering, where you can actually take a lot of data about people from them. You can use it for a range of reasons. But how quickly will that erode the trust between consumers and the companies that surround them? And how much will that have much broader implications for our societies and economies? So having those basic safeguards in place to ensure that there is trust and there is a sense of consent before data is collected and gathered is so fundamental to building a new economy and society where we actually have some guardrails in place. Yes, businesses can develop profitable business models that involve leveraging important data, but also consumers and citizens know that they're not essentially having their information sold and described and reused in ways over which they have no visibility. So that is certainly one key ethical, but also operational issue that needs to be resolved. And of course, it has implications for how data governance is done in organizations. Of course, it has potential costs, but the guarantees that puts in place for economies, for societies, for the overall fairness of the system are very important.
Do you see any connection between the data and then also human resources management? Because when we see people performing well or not well, then how can we tap into the data to improve the human resource capabilities and performance?
It's a very interesting question because there are two parts of it. One aspect is what are we measuring and what do we count as good performance or poor performance? The other aspect is what kinds of targets have we put in place for what we want our organizations to look like. So if you measure the wrong thing, you're going to maximize the wrong thing. And in the inverse, if you're actually measuring the right thing, you're able to know if you're missing key aspects of what your organization should or could be. When we spoke to business leaders and policymakers about the imperative of diversity, equity, inclusion in organizations, many of them told us that right now very few organizations are supposed to be able to know beyond gender what kind of diversity they hold in their business. But then if you look at what helps to drive innovation, one of the drivers of innovation is having different mindsets on the problem, having people with different experiences who are going to look at the same issue and come up with divergent options for moving forward that create that variety that allows innovation to thrive. Now, if you go back to understanding, is our organization poised to leverage this? You're most likely to find that unless you're at a kind of cutting edge of tracking your personnel, you don't have enough personnel data to know how many people you've had move through the ranks, what their differences were by gender and different diversity categories beyond that, and also whether you are actually tracking performance in a fair and equitable way, whether your reviewers actually had biases when they were reviewing your employees and you were not able to spot that a star performer got dropped off from the ranks because essentially there was a kind of an embedded prejudice within the system. So there's a lot that can be done with actually ensuring that there are better systems in place. But that's where the kind of very simple analytics, but very clear vision can do a lot of work.
I had a discussion with another expert about human resources management, and we talked about the transparency and fairness of the evaluation. It also comes to related to the how we can evaluate people better without being too much of subjective. But on the other hand, it also is true that people can be subjective. It's impossible to exclude all the subjectivity 100%, but still we try to minimize it. So when it comes to the analyzing the data, as you mentioned before, I don't know how much we can exclude the subjectivity and how you're going to ensure that the objectivity is actually maximized.
When you're looking at performance data. So in terms of actual HR processes or people and culture processes, there are a range of studies that have been done to try and create neutral and fair performance studies. There's also a past history that is unfortunate of having psychometric tests that are biased and don't actually measure what you'd want to measure. So one of the things that came up very strongly for us when we were creating a new toolkit on diversity, equity, and inclusion is to do your research. That you can ask people who are creating tests for your organization to actually tell you what are their metrics, have they evaluated whether these algorithms are biased to one group or another, and to actually make sure you do the due diligence to see that these are predictive of success and real performance, as opposed to particular aspects, like has somebody gone through a particular career trajectory or a particular academic trajectory, but it does not actually measure real skills and real aptitudes. So that research matters, that ability to validate and cross-check the fairness of your assessments matters. But also the processes for interviewing well, the processes for reviewing well, the new tools we have in order to check that that is happening are quite available and quite easy to learn. If you think of one example in which quite new quantitative tools have been used to understand if performance reviews are biased, you can have text mining of performance reviews that looks at the word density of particular terms when used in relation to male candidates or female candidates, and can spot if perhaps female candidates are being reviewed in biased ways. Now, if we exclude the assumption that all women have similar characteristics, you'd invariably come to the conclusion that there is a bias in the actual reviews, and a cultural bias often that will then feed into how your employees are being rated. And ultimately, it would mean skewing your performance pipeline towards one or other group.
Like hierarchy is not necessarily against the data-driven decision-making. On the other hand, hierarchy also represents maybe the lack of flexibility, or because you already determined. For example, you may already evaluate somebody and you already know that you don't like the person. And let's say that somebody is working for you and you don't like him or you don't like her. And you collect the data actually against any good evaluation about him or her. So it means that you already determined everything. The evaluation is already done in your mind through your gut feeling. But you start collecting data and building the data against him or her so that you can just give him the worst evaluation later. So what I'm trying to tell you is that first and foremost, the hierarchy is the enemy of the data-driven decision-making organization, in your opinion?
I probably wouldn't go as boldly,
Okay.
assuming that a data-driven organization and organizational structure are co-determining.
Mm.
If I think of the example that you just shared, where somebody could collect very subjective information in an inconsistent way for one particular employee, that is not actually collecting data. That's collecting factoids. Collecting data would be the instance of systematically setting up a measurement framework and then applying it to enough people so that you are able to draw out conclusions that are reliable.
Mm.
If you're doing this just collecting data on one person as opposed to a population of people, that's not necessarily a data set. That is information, but it is not a data set that can be used for decision making in a kind of a larger scale.
Maybe we can come back to that issue later, because our title, what we are discussing here, is about how we are going to improve the productivity of the people and productivity of the organization by using the data. So anyway, let's get back to that later. Let's come back to that later. That it's not that easy to find an individual with both advanced analytic skills and also the deep knowledge of the business. So maybe it's more realistic to think about how to focus on the quality of interaction between decision makers and individuals with an analytical skill set. This simply comes down to improving the team's ability to interface with each other during meetings by using a common language and methodologies that increase the quality of our conversations. Do you see that any very good idea, a way to improve the interactions between the decision makers and those who have the analytical skills? Because not all the time, those are the same people.
It's a very interesting question, and it goes back to some of the ways in which our education systems segment us from very early on into particular tracks. You're a scientist, or you're a communicator, you're an artist, or you're an engineer. We have to be very aware that we are experiencing the impact of tracks and ways in which people are developed with a particular focus on a narrow skill set. Now, the big picture aspect of this is the ability to think with future education systems that allow people more hybridity and to develop different aptitudes. So you can have a good combination of solid analytical skills and communication skills developed from an early age. And that is certainly something that people can upskill in and develop in. What is truly the barrier is the fixed mindset of thinking that it is only some segments of your workforce that will be good communicators and some segments of your workforce that can do quantitative work. And it's one of those kinds of barriers that will make it hard to encourage people to upskill and develop their skills in sometimes ways that will make them more productive. So if you have an analyst who's a great communicator, that is incredibly more efficient than having to match every analyst with a communicator and then dealing with the potential tensions and strife if you have two very polarized individuals. So the big vision aspect there is really to think through how we can incentivize a different mindset about the mix of skills we can expect in employees, but also in our education systems to think how we can incentivize more hybridity than we currently have.
So how can we translate the data insights into where they will add most value? Everyone knows the silos of excellence do no good at all. Insights or best practice should be shared across boundaries within the organization. When teams contribute to network insights, the organization can push data insights into other teams on the front line where the most value can be added. Sounds great, but in reality, people tend to work in silos because they're afraid to be blamed for anything that goes wrong. So how can we improve this kind of working in silos?
That is a very big organizational problem. It all goes back to organizational cultures and what makes for a 21st century organization, which can truly thrive on the basis of its talent.
Automated collection and sorting and easy sharing and extraction and real-time collaboration and the ability to condense diverse data sets into a single type of analysis are some of the most important but challenging factors. Do you think, is there any silver bullet to this?
So about automated data sorting and collection. Yep. It's certainly a fantastic tool to have. But there's also the question of what level of automation are we talking about? There's a lower level of automation that is clearly accessible to many individuals, and there's a higher level of automation that really is kind of has large business value, but will require a lot of time to develop. So, for example, recently myself and the team were discussing how we can collect data using APIs for a particular set of indicators we're using in our indices. That's a lower level of automation for sure. It doesn't require a very advanced skill set to do this. Does it save us a lot of time? Yes, it absolutely does. And it's a very easy efficiency to put in place. But it is not the same thing as some of the more complex automations that you can put in place in an organization.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about how you can improve the productivity by using the data. It's more about the business operation, as you said. Actually, that is the main purpose of this interview. I asked you all these questions previously is because it's relevant to understanding better about the data itself. But at the end of the day, we want to improve the productivity of the human resources and also the organization. And if it's a private sector, it's either going to be like business growth. And if it's a public sector, it's going to be about how you can deliver better to the beneficiaries or the stakeholders. But sometimes, more often than not, as you know, the evaluation actually affects the success of the organization a lot. Because let's say that you punish some people for wrong reasons and you give benefits to some people who are not the right people. And then when you see this unfair evaluation happening, then many talents might want to leave that organization. Those who are in power mostly wouldn't care too much as long as they have the benefits themselves. So the question is, the data can be very helpful to the evaluation, but as you said, how we can set the kind of a criteria for the evaluation can also affect the productivity of the organization a lot. I know that there's no best solution to some questions or problems necessarily, but what is the most ideal evaluation to promote increase the productivity by using the data, in your opinion?
So what has come back over and over again to us from different business stakeholders is that you have to evaluate what you value. So it all starts really from your organization's values. What do you care about achieving and doing well through your workforce? What are the principles that you want to embed in your organization? And then you work from those overall vision set of principles down to starting to try and understand how you would put those into relevant people and culture processes, into processes that are truly trying to track, enable, empower, and review how these are done. So actually the start is at the vision level, and the data layer and the evaluation is an implementation.
How do you see the relationship between the leadership and data-driven culture, organizational culture? Because if it's very hierarchical structure, then like a top-down, and then just one person has all the power, then no matter how well you build the system, let's say that based upon the data-driven decision-making or evaluation, the organization is not going to work anyway because it will all depends on one person. Do you think any really the fantastic or the most desirable structure that we can think about when it comes to the turn an any organization into the objective data-driven organization?
No matter how many scenarios we've tracked on what are the kinds of skills that are important in tomorrow's world, the ability to make decisions and to make a choice at some point does not go away as a key skill or something that is not automatable. The reason that's the case is because you do need leaders who can actually forge a path ahead, choices, but the ability to distribute and the ability to gather intelligence from across an organization is clearly also very valuable and part of that journey towards changing into a more digitally powered organization. Now, what that looks like in different organizations will depend on organizations themselves. And we've seen a wide variety of case studies and industry implementations of this. I think it's too early to tell whether there's any hierarchy or organizational structure that is fundamentally better. There are definitely a lot of organizations that are very data powered and very digitally powered, that are more flat and more bottom up as organizations. But I'm not sure that we yet have the evidence to be fully unilateral about whether one way or another works. The role of leadership is definitely a constant, and the importance of strong, reliable leadership that is able to make sense of the complexity around us is going to continue to be fundamental according to all the data we've been able to collect and see.
Let's say that 10 years from now, when you think about, let's say that we are living in a digital world where we have more data than before, and we know better than before that how to make good use of the data. For that direction, what do we have to prepare ourselves at the moment, you think?
One of the interesting skills that comes up over and over again is complex problem solving, and the ability to see complexity and to deal with the fact that we're able to see this multifaceted reality with a lot of different variables, a lot of different factors that are all driving sometimes the same direction and sometimes different directions. So it's clear that one of the skill sets that will allow us to do well in that future world of work is the ability to deal with complexity. And when you look at what is automatable, it's things like information processing. It's such as things like gathering the signals from all around you, but making sense of those signals and making sense of the complexity around us, including a lot of very granular data that we've never had before. That is going to be fundamental. And that continues to be that role of having more insight than ever before, and at the same time, having the potential to be deeply overwhelmed by it if you don't have the skill set and aptitude, but also the desire to embrace that and think through solutions in that more multifaceted, more complex world.
Do you think the size of the companies or organizations matters when it comes to the data-driven decision-making organization?
It does. It's undoubtedly the case that many smaller companies have less access to data than larger organizations. It depends on the organization. If you're digitally powered as an organization, if you have a digital product, you're gathering data almost by default. Whether you're making use of it, whether you synthesize it for the purposes, whether you have the necessary legal frameworks to synthesize it for the purposes, that's not clear. If you're not a digital company and you're looking to leverage data, you don't necessarily have as many data assets at your disposal. You could accrue them through partnerships. You can definitely think through what you already have, digitize it, but it's not obvious that you have the same access to data. And if you're a very small organization that doesn't have as many customers, that doesn't have as many points of interaction, probably in some cases doesn't have as many employees, of course, if you're small, then what you're looking at is a very different equation again. However, the kinds of data thinking or big data thinking that you could be engaging in is more thinking through modeling the world outside. There are fantastic amounts of statistics out there. There's market data out there. So it makes a bit of a difference whether you're talking about your own data or external data that you can access and leverage in order to make decisions about your customer base. And it also gets us back to segmenting out. Are you talking about kind of your business solutions? Are you talking about the people in your organization and having a better leadership strategy for your workforce on the basis of that data? We're talking about the markets that you're planning to engage with, doing better modeling of this. So that's where we start having a bit more differentiation between different options.
We talked about the size of the company. Actually, when it comes to the public sector, the private sector, yeah, it's true that they are really sensitive about the data collection and they try to make good use of the data because it actually comes to their, is directly related to their survival. And the small companies have difficulty in accessing the data and analyzing the data compared to the big companies. It's true, but doesn't mean that, of course, big companies will always win either. But it's also true that the small companies or small players might have more difficulty than before. That would be the story of the private sector. But public sector's case, they don't have to produce anything. They don't exactly generate the profits either. How do you think the public sector has to approach this data-driven decision making? I know it's very important. Public sector don't feel very sensitively about whether they deliver something really substantial or not.
So that's quite an interesting question because one thing to do first is to talk through the different aspects of what we mean by public sector. So if you take something like social services and you divide it into unemployment or employment agencies, and you divide it into the kinds of agencies that look after the judicial system. The kinds of innovation you've seen in those are wide-ranging. If you're looking at unemployment services, we have more data than ever before about what's happening in the real labor market. There are organizations that can literally scroll through job postings and tell you more about what's currently in demand in the labor market, what kinds of skills are being looked for, what kind of wages are being looked for. This is very different information from what the information that people might have received in previous generations if they went to an employment office. If employment offices are leveraging that information, and also in addition leveraging the information, they have access to the administrative data they have access to about who's looking for work, for what reasons. You can actually use that data to truly help people find opportunities faster, which means reducing months out of work. It means helping families who might have gone without income or without consistent income for longer. The dividends are huge. Similarly, if you look at the experiments that have been done primarily, I think, in the US, but also other economies, to introduce AI into justice systems, there have been instances where there have been attempts to triage through cases of different social services issues or justice issues and to make quicker decisions. However, what we've also seen from experts looking at what happens when that's done is that you have algorithmic biases that creep in against particular populations. So also the risks are quite big because you could say, okay, that's fantastic. You can get something done very fast, reduce administrative lag, get decisions done faster. But then what if the historical data you're using to feed those systems is suddenly creating biases against particular populations and deepening the inequalities that we see around us? So I wouldn't actually say that the public sector has less need for data, or actually less access to data. It's just a very different kind of data set. On the one hand, you have the administrative data in all government, and some governments have been very forward thinking. What they've put in place are ways to connect data sets across different parts of government with the guardrails of ethics. So are you creating a massive database of all your citizens, and is that a good thing? What might happen in the future, in a dystopian future? And on the other hand, you have large opportunities to improve the efficiency of services and actually get people opportunities faster, actually get solutions to problems faster and at lower cost. So there's a phenomenal amount of opportunity in just getting those things done well. Now, some countries are leaders in this, others are not. And that digital government aspect is a very interesting aspect of innovation.
Okay, Dr. Vasilina, thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your insight on the data-driven decision-making and how we can use the data to improve the productivity of an individual as well as the organization. Viewers, thank you so much for joining our interview today. Stay well and see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you.